Rakesh.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning here in Los Angeles, but good afternoon and good evening because we're in various time zones. Welcome to the IMHO's book launch of the new edition of Karl Marx's Critique of the Gotha Program. I want to give a shout out to our co-sponsors who include the Global Latinidades Center at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the Department of Sociology, also at UC Santa Barbara, and the Paulo Democratic Project at Chapman University. We'd also like to give a special thanks to PM Press for publishing the book and for making it available at a reduced price. And we will put the link for that in the chat. The Critique of the Gotha Program was originally written in 1875 by Karl Marx as a response to the program of the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, the Gotha Program, which articulated the party's goals. The Critique of the Gotha Program offers the fullest elaboration of Marx's vision of an alternative to capitalism that can be found in any of Marx's writings. It was first published 12 years after Marx's death in 1891. This new edition of the Critique of the Gotha Program includes a new translation and annotation by Kevin Anderson and Carol Ludenhoff. It also includes the first ever English translation of the version of the Gotha Program that was the object of Marx's critique, and a new foreword by Peter Hudis and an afterword by Peter Linebaugh. In this new publication of the critique, Hudis reminds us that our task today and moving forward is to consider Marx's ideas in light of today's social conditions and through new lenses that reflect the insights and movement of today's concrete struggles led by Black, Indigenous, Latinx, transgender, and LGBTQ+ communities and other oppressed groups. Today, we will have the opportunity to hear from and discuss with 3 panels of speakers who will be commenting on the Critique of the Gotha, on this new edition of the Critique of the Gotha Program. Each panel will last 1 hour and 45 minutes. There will be a 15-minute break between each panel. Please keep in mind that we are recording the presentations. However, the discussion following each presentation or following the panel of presentations and any comments made via the chat will not be recorded. To begin our first panel then, I'd like to introduce Rema Sufi, who will chair the first session.
Thank you, Lillian. We are very fortunate to have an excellent panel to kick us off, kick this discussion off. We have, it'll start at now and then conclude at 11:45, where we will have a break and a discussion. Carol Ludenhoff is a labor activist and writer, co-translator of the Critique of the Gotha Program from the Netherlands. Peter Linebaugh from the University of Toledo, co-author of The Many-Headed Hydra, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. Esther Leslie from Birkbeck University of London, and author of Walter Benjamin, Overpowering Conformism. Ricardo Jacobs, University of California, Santa Barbara, and South Africa, writer for Journal of Peasant Studies and other journals. So to kick us off, Carol will be our first speaker.
Thank you, Rema. Hello, everybody. In being concerned in his critique of the Gotha Program with a future classless, real human future society, Marx deals with many aspects as to such a society. I will restrict myself to the interconnectedness of the concepts individual, humanism, and a metabolism, mankind nature. Before that, I will make some remarks over, firstly, the context of this critique in Marx's thought, and secondly, Marx's thought as history and its link to actual history. In 1932, November 27, the Workers' Illustrated Journal in Germany showed pieces of a photomontage by John Hartfield, an anti-war activist and communist artist, with the title The Meaning of Geneva, where capital is living, there can be no peace. This photomontage was a political art reaction on a demonstration of workers in Geneva against fascism in front of the building of the League of Nations on November 9, a demonstration where at the end of confrontations between workers and police, there were 15 deaths and more than 60 wounded under the demonstrators. Although Hartfield's statements about capitalism and war surely still holds today, we live now in a world where besides rising fascism and ongoing wars, exploitation, oppression and racism brought about by capitalism, the capitalists, by the exhausting of the natural resources in their pursuit for surplus value and profit, endanger the existence of human, animal and vegetable life in their interconnectedness. All these threats of war and oppression, and in an increasing size, the threat for humanity in its metabolism with animal and vegetable life and with natural resources as a precondition for human life, cry for an alternative to capitalism. In the process of thinking over and trying to create an alternative to capitalism, Marx' critic of the Gotha Program lays down a guide, and I emphasize a guide and not a blueprint, In a certain sense, when we talk about an alternative to capitalism, we are imagining an architecture of a future real human society. Inadvertently, the comparison which Marx makes in Capital Volume 1 between the activity of the bee and the human being forces itself on us. As for the nature of activity in the production process in general, it is abstracting from value production, Marx is saying that we presuppose labor in a form that stamps it as exclusively human. A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. Marx continues then by saying that at the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. He not only effects a change of form in the material on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own that gives the law to his modus operandi and to which he must subordinate his will. The distinction at the analytical level which Marx is making here between the production process in general and the specific of the production process in capitalist society, producing surplus value, is important for the way how we imagine an alternative to capitalist society, for the processes of thinking and knowledge over an activity in capitalist society are determined in the last instance by the production relations of this society, thus by the production of value and surplus value. It will be clear that we are here in the center of a dialectical process of determination and being determined, in which knowledge has primarily a class character. Later in my talk, I will return to what Marx presupposition exclusively human means for his critique of the Gotha program. In his letter to Braque, Marx describes his critique of the program of Gotha as critical marginal notes and conceived of as a lengthy squid. As to the context of these critical marginal notes within the thought of Marx, the French Marxist Isabelle Garot says something useful things in her Communism and Strategy. She writes that in order to understand the substance of these notes, we have to be alert on Marx's attention after 1848, accompanied by his developing of the critique of political and economy, and above all in the reference of Marx to his capital as a revolutionary weapon against bourgeoisie. It concerns on world history as there are social and political struggles in France, in England, the popular revolts in China and India, the Civil War and slavery in the US, the national liberation movements in Ireland and Poland, the mobilizing of the Russian populists. For all these events would recapture his strategic reflection and sometimes correct his earlier analysis. Further, she emphasizes that as to these notes, it is important to read together the relevant texts of the critic of political economy, above all Capital and its preparatory texts, and the text of the conjuncture of the last period, which are based on the topical matters of the world, to wit, the Paris Commune and the revolutionary perspective in Russia, because we can by that get an eye on how Marx analyzes the entanglement of the economic conditions, social processes, and political struggles. Marx's texts during this period, she pursues, although different in style, but with their concepts and their size, turn out to be deeply united by their object, capitalism, captured from various angles and points of view. They all come together in a same critique in theory and dealing with politics. The notions of Garot about the context of Marx's critique of the Gotha program find moreover strong support in the way Marx's works come to us today through the Mega, for besides the publications of his own works, articles in journals and letters to and from him, the Mega gives us insight in the incredible many-sidedness of his theoretical activity via the excerpt he made in the domains of the history of religion, ethnology, philosophy, natural sciences, economics, and politics. As to the context of Marx's critique of the Gotha program for nowadays, and I emphasize for nowadays, it is, to my opinion, further of the greatest importance and aspect to describe as history and new realities. Peter Hudis refers to this aspect in his report for the IMHO 2018 convention, as he writes, however, a body of thought is helpful only to the extent that it is taken seriously, studied, debated, and redeveloped in light of new realities. Attempts to develop alternatives by neglecting history, either actual history or the history of thought, go nowhere. You are only as tall as the shoulders you stand upon. In specifying the link of history of Marx's thought to new realities, thus of his thought to our day, Raya Dunayevskaya wrote in her book about Rosa Luxemburg, catching the historic link to Marx is not only a matter of finally seeing all his writings, but of grasping at one and the same time that something had to happen both in the movement from practice and in the movement from theory. After these remarks about the context of Marx's critique of the Gotha Program, I now would like to say something about some topics in it. Earlier in my talk, I referred to Marx's presupposition exclusively human. That Marx refers here to human, and even exclusively human, is not surprising, for the totality of his thought is pervaded with the being of the humanness in capitalist society and his focus on human freedom. In dealing with the items of metabolism between nature and humankind, humanism and the individual, which we can perceive in his critique of the program of Gotha, the issue of this aspect, human, is omnipresent. Let me begin with the topic of the individual. Marx notes in his critique that after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be completely transcended, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. He is talking this in this passage in 1875 about the all-round development of the individual, and from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. This notion we also find in the much earlier written Communist Manifesto as to communism, and formulated as, in place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Similar formulations are to find in the Grundrisse and Capital. The remarks in the critique of 1875 about the free development of the individual join in seamless to what Marx and Engels say about the substance of the individual in their foreword to the Holy Family in 1844. Real humanism has no more dangerous enemy in Germany than spiritualism or speculative idealism, which substitutes self-consciousness or the spirit for the real individual man. In other words, we see that there is a continuum in the whole of Marx's thought about real individual man and his rejection of, under other things, Feuerbach's abstract man. In order to get a better understanding on how Marx conceives of the real human being, I refer to a letter he wrote to Annenkov, December 28 in 1846. Quote, "The simple fact that every succeeding generation finds productive forces acquired by the preceding generation and which serve it as the raw material of further production engenders a relatedness in the history of man, engenders a history of mankind. This is all the more a history of mankind as man's productive forces and hence his social relations have expanded. He pursues them, Marx, and that is crucial for his conception of real individual human being and the substance of his humanism. From this, it can only be concluded that the social history of man is never anything else than the history of his individual development, whether he is conscious of this or not. His material relations form the basis of all his relations. These material relations are but the necessary forms in which his material and individual activity is realized. In making clear and summarizing Marx's thoughts about the human specifics of social history, thus the history of humanity, and the history of individual development, the late Lucien Serre says that, quote, social history, by which means the cumulatively transformative process that the collective activity of individuals induces from generation to generation in the way of life of the group, which differs completely from biological evolution, by which the animal organism and the behavioral repertory of the population under consideration are modified in a comparably slower and narrower way. There is no social history of ants. Secondly, because in a related way, there is also no history of individual development in any animal species. Let us specify the way in which both genetically regulated and contextually modulated the behavior of the individual unfolds in it during his life, does not itself transform cumulatively over the generations into a function of a social history of the species with it missing. So we see that Marx's notions of the real individual being, social history, and history of individual development, resulting in Marx's notion of humanism and not humanism in general, were developed in his critique of capitalism. That means that Marx's critique of capital is not to separate from humanism, as Hudis emphasizes in his above-mentioned report, by writing that, quote, Marx's critique of capital is inseparable from humanism, and he examines Marx's critique of value production in capitalist society and the alienated human relations in that society by saying, value may be a rather abstract category, but it depends upon a concrete kind of human activity. Labor that is constrained by an abstract time determination outside of the worker's control. Abolishing capitalism requires uprooting the alienated human relations that make value production possible. There is no other way. There is no other way out, and I add, nota bene, no other way out. Right in the beginning of his critique of the Gotha Program, of course conditioned because the Gotha Program starts with the notion that labor is the source of all wealth and all culture, Marx thus emphasizes that labor is not the source of all wealth. For nature, as he writes, is just as much the source of use values, and it's surely of such that material wealth consists, as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. And he continues by saying that firstly, only insofar as the human being from the beginning behaves toward nature, the primary source of all objects and instruments of labor, as an owner treats her as belonging to him, his labor becomes the source of use values, therefore also of wealth. And secondly, that since it follows precisely from labor's dependence on nature that workers with no other property than their labor power must, in all conditions of society and culture, be the slave of other human beings who make themselves the owners of the material conditions of labor. He can only work by their permission and hence only live with their permission. In the Paris manuscripts, in the part on alienated labor, where Marx is writing about the alienation of human beings in capitalist society, he develops the notion that human beings are alienated from nature and from the products they create in the production process, are alienated in the activity they carry out to produce these products, and are alienated from themselves and from other people. Kohei Saito, in his Karl Marx Eco-Socialism, refers to Marx's notion of the alienation of the human being from nature as a key but implicit ecological notion, and he writes that Marx sees the reason for the emergence of modern alienated life in a radical dissolution of the original unity between humans and nature.
My apologies, Carol. Just a reminder. Just a reminder. It's been 15 minutes.
Only a few minutes. Sorry. Capitalism is fundamentally characterized by alienation of nature and a distorted relationship between humans and nature. A distortion, yes, but I add also a process of destruction of life. For as Marx writes in Capital Volume 1, capitalist production therefore develops technology and the combining together of various processes into a social whole only by sapping the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the labor. Marx's statement comes not out of the blue. Above, I refer to the mega edition, which gives insight in the incredible many-sidedness of Marx's theoretical activity. We see that he, for example, in an early stage of his research, is interested in the concept of physiology, and that his notion of metabolism in the broadest sense of the word more and more did get weight as he developed his critique of political economy and his research on the relations between humankind and nature. It would play societal a central role in his critique of political economy. And when we talk about Marx's notion of socialism, communism in the critique of the Gotha Program, in relation to the metabolism of mankind and nature, we have to remember and what he says in the Paris manuscripts, the part of private property and communism, as he writes about communism as for the real human being, humanism, nature, alienation in capitalist society and freedom. Communism, therefore, as the complete return of man to himself as a social being. This communism, as fully developed, naturalism equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, and between man and man, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. I love it so. Okay.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, well, we are running a little bit behind, so I'll remind everyone to please stay within 15 minutes so that we don't lose time in the discussion. Next, I'll invite Peter Linebaugh to
Wake me 15 minutes. Yeah, I just told my smartphone to ring a bell in 15 minutes, but I should be shorter because Carol's opening remarks really, for me, are comprehensive, and I very much welcome his deep and philosophical summations of the importance of this critique, which after all is very short in comparison to Marx, to Das Kapital or the Grundrisse or even the economic and philosophical manuscripts. I speak as a historian, and the event that meant most perhaps to see the significance of this critique and of Marx's relationship to it, at least in Engels' view, was the Paris Commune. And I just want to remind myself that the Paris Commune began by abolishing the death penalty. And secondly, it brought down the symbol of imperialism, the Vendôme column. And third, and perhaps most important, was the formation of the Women's Union. And these three aspects of the Commune must be placed in relationship to the Kabylie revolt in Algeria, which was a revolt against the privatization of common lands in Algeria. So right away, and just also, by the way, Marx, of course, went to Algeria later as his lungs were suffering, and the air in North Africa was cleaner than the air in London, whose smog and coal dust was ruinous to the pulmonary functions. Thank you also, Carol, for reading aloud the first lines of Marx's critique that begins with a resounding negation that labor's not the only source of wealth, but that nature is. And I want to remind folks that I'm speaking to you from one of the largest sources of fresh water on the planet, here among the Great Lakes of North America, or Turtle Island. This is significant for me, as water is fundamental to life, as our bodies themselves consist of it. But for Marx, it was important, this first comment he wanted to make about nature and his critique of capitalism, or his critique of Lassalle and the Gotha Program, was that Lassalle allied himself with the owners of land, the Prussian Junkers. So Marx finds it necessary to explain that that land, having been enclosed, privatized, commodified, and conquered from its previous inhabitants, becomes essential to capitalism, a basis of capital. So this contrast between those who work on the land and those who don't, and as well as the contrast between the Junkers and the capitalists, is not fundamental. And the second thing I wanted to make, second point I wanted to make about nature, so-called, really comes from the end of Marx's life, not so much the young Marx, but the old Marx, and his ethnological notebooks, where his joy, his delight in naming the critters, the creatures that live in the part of the forested world that I inhabit. When he speaks of the eagle, he speaks of the wolf, he speaks of coyotes. These are the world, and not a unitary. Philosophically, I'm not sure how to put this, but even the concept of nature sometimes is an abstraction that is so separate from our relations. Our relations include water. Our relations include the animate world. And this is not the major point, of course, to Marx, but it is to us. But to revivify that animated world and our relations, we need Marx and to save our own soul. Remember, Marx quotes Ezekiel, the prophet, who said that he spoke and therefore saved his soul. And this is how Marx begins his critique of the Gotha Program, by going back to perhaps what he'd learned in childhood. I want to really take this point to thank all the conveners of today's meeting, Peter Hudis in particular, the translator, the publisher, PM Press, for bringing us together to speak. Because what Marx is telling us is that our souls depend on our words, our spoken words. And this, he says at the beginning, he saves his soul by speaking. And this is what is so essential to our movement, whether it's at Standing Rock or whether it's Terra Huasca on behalf of the water protectors, who, even as we speak, is now in Geneva, advocating on behalf of our relations, the fresh water of the Great Lakes. She is among indigenous Anishinaabe people in not so much around Lake Michigan as Lake Superior and the many lakes of Minnesota. Yeah, so I definitely wanted to bring that in. And then, of course, the women's movement, the feminist movement, has relied on speaking truth to power and to one another, to find a voice, to find words. And this is true now and goes back to the other major event at the time of Marx's critique of the Gotha Program, which is found in the history written by W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm speaking of Black Reconstruction, and that whole phase that we see from 1867 to 1876 is a period that Du Bois calls of, I was just looking for his, to make sure I get his words exactly right, that the rebuilding, he speaks after the war to free the slaves in North America. We must go back to the basic principles of Reconstruction. These are land, light, and leading for slaves, black, brown, yellow, and white, under a dictatorship of the proletariat. So this phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, probably is classic, going to Roman times, But for Du Bois, writing in the 1930s, it had to do with the land, the light, and the leadership of slaves, black, brown, yellow, and white. And this, I think, also is essential to us, and to understand that wage labor, so-called wage labor, is a slavery. And to understand what slavery means in our day, at our time, in our prisons, in our factories, in the boats that sink in the sea. To understand the expropriation from the commons in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and in Europe. Yeah. So I've got to stick to the Gotha program here. Yes. He has this great phrase, to lift the historical curse. I find it deep, to lift that curse. And he does so with the help of a woman, well, with many women, but I'm thinking especially of Elizabeth Dmitriev in Geneva, who helped him with the knowledge of the Obshchina in Russia, or the commons in Russia. I think other possibilities of communism comes not just from the imagination and dreaming, but as has been said among us, comes also from history and real experience. I see there is a number up there that says 5, so I will pause for a minute to look over my notes to see whether there is anything else essential that I wish to say. And there is one last thing, which is going back to the early Marx. He was in favor of plucking the living flower, as he says it. This was his in a way, his critique of religion, which was to pluck not just the imaginary flowers on the chain, but to throw off the chain to pluck the living flower. It's a metaphor of the earth. Yeah. Anyway, that's enough for me for the time being. I look forward to the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Peter. I would like to invite Esther Leslie to please begin.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about demonic critique in the Gotha program. So Marx's Capital was written in a time of retrenchment, some 20 years after the turbulent days of 1848, when revolutionary fervor swept Europe and beyond. To write Capital's critique of political economy, Marx retreated in part from active political agitation into the British Museum reading room, a kind of holding operation of analysis in order to forward the cause intellectually, logically, ideologically. Marx subjected his own analysis to critique, again after the events of the Paris Commune, when he undertook revisions of Capital in French and German. Critique may appear as an intellectual activity, a library-bound examination in reflection. Critique or criticism, both words are the same in German, Kritik, also occurs in the title of the key work, Capital, which has the subtitle, A Critique of Political Economy. This might tell us that critique has a force, even if some might dismiss it as an evasion of the command to act, a stalling action of analysis and reflection. And critique is often, as it must be if it is not to become dogma, as much about an examination of Marxism's own tenets as it is about the constituents of the surrounding world, through the mechanism of critique, a multiple referencing between what has been thought and said by you, by others, and what is happening in the world that is thought about and talked about. Something emerges which is informed by the world, but desirous to lift off from it. Marx returned to Capital in the 1870s and issued it in French in small pamphlets, distributed there in cheap, accessible portions, not great tomes that demand to swallow vast tracts of time. Critique is critique of analysis, but also approach, how to communicate, not just what. An insight, incidentally, that Walter Benjamin came to some decades later in his political aesthetic analysis in 1930 on the author as producer, where he assessed what the mass cultural forms that existed of radio, film, photography, photomontage, worker correspondent newspapers, and pamphlets meant in the wider scheme of the social world, and how developments such as multiple printing and other forms of mass reproduction change humans' relationship to culture of the past and the present. Benjamin's notion is that cultural production adopts the character of a model, that it places an improved apparatus at the disposal of authors and audiences, bringing those audiences into contact with the production process, turning readers into collaborators. I want to stay with Benjamin and the Commune, a context for Marx's own revisions and critique in the 1870s. Benjamin's great unfinished study of capital's subsumption of Paris, the Arcades Project, outlines a panoramic history, and the Paris Commune features in it as tragedy, as failed effort at revolutionary overthrow, in which finally, dripping in their own blood, the communards mete out political terror against a state that has far greater reserves. Resting on shaky foundations, the revolt seemed only to fail, and left historians by Benjamin's time of writing in the 1930s have already come to know this, saying that inspiring as it was as an emblem of spontaneous refusal and uncompromising insurgency, the Commune lacked a carefully prepared social basis. Its insurrection rises quickly like an untethered balloon that can soon enough be pierced and deflate. But in contrast to those who dispense political reproaches about failures of social and political form, Benjamin lingers on the devilish detail of hellish events in and after the Commune. Included among these devilish details are the Commune's demonic power of critique, as he sees it. And while visiting the first exhibition about the Commune in Paris, in Saint-Denis in 1935, he noticed a placard from the 15th of April, 1871. It proposed a communard monument to the accursed. Hammered into it would be all the names of official personalities of the Second Empire who made what the communards called an infernal history. Napoleon I is included, the villain of Brumaire, the chief of this accursed race of crowned Bohemians, vomited forth to us by Corsica, this fatal line of bastards, so degenerated they would be lost in their own native land. Baron Haussmann, architect of the wide boulevard, arch demolitioner of Paris, is dishonoured too, for he made Paris ready for the sweeping through of military vehicles. Marx talks about Paris of the sightseer and the tourist. The wide street is a weapon of the state, and it will smash up Paris, which is a breeding ground of intrigue, rebellion, gossip, poetry. Haussmann's boulevards pave over hope and banish disorder. The Commune is an excited yelp of chaos, but it becomes a hellfire scorched by the forces of reaction. Benjamin tells of fugitives executed after a chase through the underworld of the skeleton-filled catacombs. This infernal history was not commiserated by the communards in stone in a monument, but instead took the Commune as its consummation. Benjamin points out how Blanqui, champion of insurrection, sees in its defeat only an eternity of repetition, the end of history, but Benjamin perceives instead its marking the end of a phantasmagoria, which was a promise of universal liberation that had been broken time after time by the bourgeoisie. It becomes ever clearer as he quotes from a newspaper of the time that every manufacturer lives in his factory like a plantation owner amongst his slaves. Marx, I think, inherits this demonic power of critique that Benjamin identifies, and he directs it not just at analyzing historical events and failures of organization on the part of revolutionary leaders, but directs it too into the interior of capital itself, recalibrating his and others' thinking. One aspect of practical critique that comes out in the Gotha Program, as elsewhere, observes that to be anti-capitalist is to execute a rebellion against time. Again, it is Benjamin who, for me, provides the anecdotal material to make sense of this insight in relation to the training school of revolution that is the 19th century. Incubated by the various waves of revolution and reaction from 1789 to 1830, as capitalism finds its modes and forms, is time's transformation into a homogeneous, endless cycling and recycling. It's to this that the armed workers in July 1830 respond, shooting at clock towers in a rebellion against ruling class time. As Benjamin puts it, the consciousness of exploding the continuum of history is peculiar to the revolutionary classes at the moment of their action. And indeed, if one roots further in archives, one might find a note to Charles X from a major general which states, in an alarmed tone, "Sire, it is no longer a riot, it is revolution. It is urgent for your majesty to take measures for pacification. The honor of the crown can still be saved. Tomorrow, perhaps, there will be no more time. I await with impatience your majesty's orders." No more time, then. What the revolution does is to interrupt time and to take it back under control of the workers. This revolutionary moment should be drawn out into permanence because it's the moment in which liberation is realized, stopping time to inaugurate a new time, a sublation of time that is, in Hegelian terms, an annulment, preservation, and erasing of time to a higher instance. In any case, in the act of destroying the clocks, time manifests itself as a battleground in workers' lives. Marx absorbs the lessons of the past to direct demonic powers of critique. He breaks into the Gotha Program with critique. What he does is to develop critique as a line-by-line refutation of thinking, inaugurating a mode of political praxis that extends forwards through various objections in the margins and contradictory approaches. I want to consider this writing back, this procedure by critique, as a politicized practice that leaves a certain legacy, or alternatively is spurred by the kind of impulses that spurred Marx to crack up the surface of the proposition that was in error. We could look, for example, at the demonic critique of Karl Kraus, lambasting the daily output of the press in the journal The Torch from 1899 to 36. He recognizes how technology plays a role in corrupting language, making possible the rapid and mass replication of the so-called empty phrase, the nonsense spewed out every day by the newspaper printing presses, which demanded certain, or still demand certain quantities of data at certain times of the day. This technical change was far-reaching. Journalism could be clearly seen as the expression of the changed function of language in the world of high capitalism. The corruption of language related to the corruption of thought and to corrupted actions, such as war. In addition, Kraus sort of concocted ways of entering into that corrupted language in order to deform it further, such that it might eventually be brought back into honest expression, pasting, for example, irritating newspaper clippings onto pieces of paper and encircling it with his comments in the way that Marx sort of cracks in to the Gotha Program, or printing conflicting news reports in parallel columns to expose the general duplicity of the press. We could think of Lenin too, annotating Hegel from September 1914, when war breaks into the world of thought. Lenin studied the science of logic. His abstract of Hegel's science of logic is 150 pages long. The commentary exceeds the object, like any good critic would do, completing and transforming what it apprehends. Notes from 1915 on other works by Hegel and on Hegel take up another 100 pages. What are these notebooks? Long extracts in German from Hegel, interspersed with commentary, marginalia, and workings through of what the dialectic is or must become. While official Marxism was little interested in the philosophical notebooks or in Hegel, other traditions understood the significance of this. And as Kevin Anderson has quoted, Henri Lefebvre said in his own margins in an autobiography in 1959, Lenin did not read or study Hegel seriously until 1914 to 15. Also, if one considers it objectively, one notices a great difference in tone and content between the notebooks on the dialectic and materialism and imperio-criticism. Lenin's thought becomes supple, alive, in a word, dialectical. Lenin did not fully understand the dialectic until 1914, after the collapse of the International. I'm struck by the metaphor of suppleness, of litheness or aliveness. It is as if in the dialectical art of contradicting, quite literally, energy enters into thinking and into practice. That is the power of the critique. It raises the question of movement, a shift, a movement in thought and tactics. Movement goes back to the drawing board, as in what is to be done, burning questions of our movement in 1901, where Lenin says, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. The workers may move and the workers' movement form, but to make it revolutionary, to introduce the truly mobile into the movement, requires theory that is the intellectual impetus of the party. Progress, Benjamin declares, is a 19th century phantasm. The trust in progress affected philosophers and industrialists as well as social democratic reformists. Benjamin's On the Concept of History from 1940 presents a critique of progress as exemplified in 19th century historiography, produced by a bourgeoisie that had reneged on any critical attitude, for it no longer had a use for it. Progress becomes dogma at the moment when it's no longer socially critical concept. And Benjamin writes some things about this, and he's tracking a sort of move of socialism away from revolution to evolution. And he notes a confusion that arises in social democracy at this time, where it holds a misguided understanding of the role of labor, which turns into a fetish of labor, a belief in salvation through technology rather than through altering the relations of production. So he says, the vulgar Marxist conception of the nature of labor bypasses the question of how its products might benefit the workers. While still not being at their disposal, it recognizes only the progress in the mastery of nature, not the retrogression of society. It already displays the technocratic features later encountered in fascism. So it had been so convinced, social democracy, that progress would occur and was occurring, so sure of an existence of a mass base under any circumstances, that they entered into alliances and bargains with the political establishment. And I suppose, this technological development, this industrial production that outstrips human needs, as Benjamin puts it, most notably perhaps in the production of newspaper copy and in armaments, and the swooning crowds which are mobilized but not active in themselves, brought about something quite other than socialism. World War, it threatened to do this again. What Marx tries to head off in 1875 in his critique of the Gotha Program outflows into all that comes after so lethally, and it demanded critique and revised analysis, a situation that's still ongoing. So thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Just a reminder that after the last presentation, we will have a period of discussion, and I believe that after that we will have a break before the next panel. So I ask Ricardo Jacobs to please begin.
Thank you. I will be very short. I think most of the underlying points have been touched upon. But I think I want to perhaps bring us back to the most obvious point and think through what does it particularly mean. I think the critique, what I want to start with is to think about the programmatic basis of alternatives to capitalism, or to abolish the present state of things. Because from my starting point is the critique is not a negation of programs, but it provides us with a method of evaluating programs. And I want to sort of stay with this notion of thinking through political programs, political demands, and this notion that emerges through the critique of the Gotha program of rectification and recalibration, that one can think about it through those terms. So I think this new translation of the critique, I want to congratulate the translators, the authors who wrote the introduction, and this new translation, because it's a timely historical period of a great planetary crisis. And it will, I think it will help us to move the conversation forward in discussing and rethinking alternatives to capitalism, which is in the imagination of everyone, at least I think politically, and how it will assist us with current debates about capitalism. You know, as the book suggests, these alternatives, as Peter Hudis in particular suggests, is very under-theorized or not part of the thinking, you know, even though the working people are putting this on the agenda, or putting new social questions as it is articulated within the introduction. And I think this is an important point for us to think about what is called the real movement or of working people, and the anticipatory character of these particular struggles, but also the type of political alternatives that is emerging. And so I want to focus on the political programs, and I promised myself I will be brief. I should have just gone for 5 minutes, but I think I already passed 5 minutes. To think about political demands and to really think about these points about internationalism and the global dimension of struggle. So I really just wanted to deal with these obvious points that is emerging again in the 21st century, with not providing solutions, but I think that is guiding us to what the critique and its re-examining allow us to do is to I think we should interrogate these elements about the relation between the national dimension and the global dimension of struggle, political programs, political demands, and ultimately thinking about the self-government of working people, or what, as Luca Basso calls it, working class struggle in common, right? So I first want to start with independent political programs coupled with political demands. I think is a necessity in the current context, particularly if we think about alternatives to capitalism. And I think what emerges for me out of the critique is independent political programs coupled with political demands, but independent from bourgeois thinking and political influences, which I think is central to the critique. So it's not just about the critique, but also how bourgeois influences also are shaping alternatives to capitalism. And I think this is an important point to think about if we think about programs as a guide to action. So precisely what is a political program and what purpose does it serve? And I think in this point has already been pointed, but I just want to re-emphasize in his letter to Wilhelm Braque, I don't know, Marx states, first, the program is a guidepost and a set of principles, you know, coupled with political demands in the struggles to descend capitalism. And of course, here the argument is that, and I want to quote what he says, by drawing up a program of principles, and in brackets, instead of positioning this until they've been prepared for a considerable period of common activity, one sets up before the whole world guideposts by which to measure the level of progress. Of course, this is the critique, but I want to suggest that there is two elements to this critique. One is that it allows us to evaluate, and it's the method of evaluating political programs through a scientific method, and to look at examine its revolutionary perspective, but also to assess the level of progress of working people's organization, or as it put it, the party's level of progress, as the new translation put it. So this moves us away from thinking about political programs in very static and linear forms of conceptualization that then presents itself as new forms of domination upon working people, because you have a program that is superimposed on working people instead of something very dynamic that is in conversation between these two. And I think this is for a point to think about conceptualization and formulation of political programs that can speak to the objective condition of transcending capitalism. Again, these are not blueprints, but they are important guideposts, as Marx articulated in the letter, and it should be a guide to action. And as Esther said, the importance of critique, even of political programs, and even the outcomes of the real movement of people cannot be outside of the level of critique, because then we begin to essentialize even the real movement, and then we have to have that interaction and dialectical relation. And then the third aspect, which I think Peter Linebaugh and others have also talked about, is this thing of, in the letter, every step of the real movement is more important than a dozen program. This might suggest that class struggle is more important and that we should focus on that, but I want to suggest it's through the political activity or working in common or class struggle that ideas or theory in political programs can become a material force. In cases, they also transcend the ideas. And this is the point for Marx about the dictatorship of the proletariat, that the Paris Commune gives effect to these ideas and say, this is what I'm actually talking about. This is where you have the first expression of this particular idea. And so for me, the point about programs and its dialectical relation between political demands and political programs, and thinking about how that is interconnected with the real programs of people. So in this sense, I want to suggest that the real movement can advance and transcend what is contained in programs, but at the same time, programs are also important building blocks in putting new political demands on the agenda of working people in particularly. So again, they can then serve as guideposts by which to measure the party's or political program's level of progress or its revolutionary content. And I think for me, I just, of course, stating the obvious, but I think it's an important point also to think about the programmatic basis of thinking about alternatives to capitalism. Otherwise, I want to suggest this whole exercise that we are engaging in becomes sort of meaningless. It becomes navel-gazing if it is not an objective to infuse these political demands within the struggles of working people. And equally true, if the real existing struggles of the real movement is not able to influence our own ways of thinking about rectification and recalibration and rearticulation, I think that is also where we will be engaging in a dead-end politics. I think in my last 5 minutes, I think it's important also as the program, the critique says, the commitment to internationalism without falling into a narrow nationalism, which is often the case in the way in which we frame our own political struggles. And I think that is an important way to deal with the international dimension of moving towards communism, right? So this is this two dimension, and to think about class struggle in permanence and revolution in permanence, which is an important point that has been articulated by Trotsky, Dunayevskaya's critique of that. And I think but still, I think it's salient, is more important for us to grapple with this today. So today, so one can ask who are the real movements of people today, which is an important question. And I think the conclusion by Peter Linebaugh suggests one can think of them as peasantry, indigenous people, women, oppressed people, working people in general, that will concretize and give expression to the transcendence of capitalism. And class struggle and revolution, particularly in the notion of transition, is critical as the program, as Marx's critique of the program states, that corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. I think for me, it's not about the new form. I think between Peter Hudis, all the Peters and Kevins, they have dealt with this aspect. But for me, what I want to emphasize is that this political transition is not a suspension of class struggle, right? But I want to suggest it's an intensification of class struggle. Because one has to think about revolution as an uninterrupted process, right? And where one so it moves us away from a sort of static, linear form of thinking about this as a static and linear transition from one system to the other, and how one particularly deal with this. So I want to conclude by thinking about this other important points of how one can think about, agrarian questions, which is central in thinking about this through, because there's this sort of notion that with the establishment of commodity relations, that the agrarian question as defined by many sort of disappears. But the question is the real movement of people, indigenous people, present and everywhere, are putting this question again on the table and the agenda, not in this narrow sense, but also putting it, influencing our understanding of thinking about the ecological crisis and how to restore the metabolic rift. It's not coincidence that it's indigenous people, it's peasants, it is all oppressed classes that have put this question on the political agenda. And I think this as all speakers have emphasized, if we focus on the real existing struggles, this will allow us to think about how to develop the programmatic basis of an anti-capitalist, ecological, post-capitalist future. So I want to end it by that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our speakers for this energizing discussion. Can we start our discussion period now? And I would just like to read from our community agreements to remind folks that this is a radical learning space, and where we develop ideas dialectically, which means in the world around us, but also inside each of us. So we aim to center voices of revolution, including women, Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people, LGBTQ, youth, workers, and other oppressed and exploited groups. Please join us in making space for those voices and respecting our community agreements. Number one, one mic, one voice. Only one person should speak at a time. And for today's Zoom meeting, we will be taking stack for speaking. So please either indicate in the chat that you would like to be on stack or raise your hand. You can also